Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Video Game Chronicles. Today I'm going to talk about a couple of clone systems that are coming out pretty soon. One's the RetroN 5, the other is the Analogue Nt. And I'll talk about the Analogue Nt after. I'm going to talk about the RetroN 5 first. And this is actually going to be a physical review. It's not going to be an overall review since I don't have it, since it hasn't come out yet. It's going to be a physical review of basically how it looks and stuff, and what are the pros and cons. So that's what I'm going to talk about first off. And if I ever get it, there will be an overall review for sure to see how it plays or whatnot. This is just going to be a physical review of the RetroN 5, and that's it. So, the RetroN 5 is of course made by RetroN, and it's supposed to play NES, Famicom, Super Famicom, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Sega Mega Drive, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. That's why it's called the RetroN 5. And it's supposed to play all those games on one clone system. And that's basically the system in a nutshell. It's supposed to play all those games on one. And that's the first pro about the RetroN 5. The other pro is the controller. It's supposed to be much better. And it looks much better for sure. And it's definitely going to be a lot better than the RetroN 3 wireless controller, which was, if you've seen reviews, quite horrible. The RetroN 3 wireless controller was quite bad. So the RetroN 5 controller looks cool, and it's a step up for sure. Another good thing about the RetroN 5 is the fact that it has controller ports. NES, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis. So you could actually plug in a Genesis, Super Nintendo, or NES controller. Yeah, if you have any in supply, you can plug those in. That's pretty cool. Another thing, it's going to have multiple video outputs. And one, as a matter of fact, there's going to be one for HDMI. So you can actually have better picture quality on your HD TV. Another good thing about this system, it's going to have multiple options. You're going to be able to save your game, you're going to be able to use Game Genie codes, and you're going to be able to set the way you want your game. You can have scan lines, and there's going to be other options as well. So that's another good sign with the system. And that's the last plus I can give for the RetroN 5. Now I'm going to talk about the physical flaws with the RetroN 5, because I feel that RetroN missed the boat on these, and if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be talking about it. Well, let's get to the first one, shall we? Of course, you know I have the Game Boy player, and if you look right there, you'll see that there is a link cable connection for the Game Boy. Now this gives you the option of hooking up a link cable to a Game Boy, or even the 4-player adapter for the Game Boy, and it'll essentially allow you to play 2, 3, or 4 players. The RetroN 5 doesn't have that. Yep, RetroN never bothered to put one in, and I gotta say, why? Why? If you're going to put a slot for Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games, why not put the link cable connection on the RetroN 5? That is no excuse. Second flaw about the RetroN 5. Now I know, RetroN, that you put in a Famicom cartridge slot. However, you didn't put a Famicom expansion port on the RetroN 5. And you know what that means? It means you're not going to be able to use any Famicom peripherals on the RetroN 5. None. Because HyperKin didn't even put an expansion port on the RetroN 5. Why? That is, I don't know what that is. It might be stupidity on HyperKin's part, or they just never thought about it. No expansion port. No Famicom expansion port. Means no peripherals. Means you can't use a single peripheral that were made for the Famicom. Yep. Sucks. It sucks, doesn't it? But that's not the only thing. Not whatsoever. There's still one more flaw I gotta talk about. However, this has been in all clones. Or should I say most clones. There was one particular clone that allowed for this particular thing. But HyperKin still hasn't done it. Now, the Famicom expansion port was also in the Sharp Twin Famicom and the AV Famicom. So there's no excuse not to put in a Famicom expansion port, HyperKin, for the RetroN 5. I just don't get that. But now I'm going to get into the last big flaw with the RetroN 5. Well, let's get into it, shall we? The last big flaw with the RetroN 5, and this has plagued most clone systems, even the RetroN 3 and the RetroN 2 as well. Now, of course, you know about the NES control ports. You know that they're just like this. However, on the NES, they're close together. They are close together. In 1989, Nintendo released the NES Satellite. And then a year later, they released the NES 4-Score. These were both 4-player adapters. Now, the 4-player adapters were just like this. Of course, this is how it is on the NES 4-Score. Look, they're together. Here is the problem with most clone systems. They separate the controller ports, meaning that they're not like this. They're separate from each other, which means without modification or a way to get the 4-Score or satellite, NES satellite, to work on a clone system, you have to do certain things. Means without modification, you're not going to be able to use this. Meaning no 4 players. Means you're stuck having to play 2 players only. So why, HyperKin, do you have to separate the controller ports? Why? And for the rest of you, the one that makes these clone systems with NES controller ports that separate the controller ports, why do you have to do this? Well, I don't want to have to mod my NES Satellite or NES 4-Score just to use it. Or to play 4 players. I don't get that. Why do these companies have to do that? Even you, HyperKin, why? What would have been best if you would actually put in 4 controller ports for the NES? Or put the controller ports for the NES together like this. That way I could use the NES 4-Score or NES Satellite if I had that. But I'm not going to be able to do that without modification. Why do companies have to do that? I just don't get it. And I'm probably going to do a big rant about it probably soon. But I just don't get it. The only company that has learned, and there's another company too, even though the company is not, you're not going to be able to use the NES Satellite or NES 4-Score on this particular system. However, they do something different. And I'll explain that when I get to it. That's later in this video. But the only clone system that's ever done that uses NES controller ports that's allowed you to use the NES Satellite or NES 4-Score without modification is the Generation X. Yep, the Generation Next is the only one that has the controller ports together. No one has learned from Messiah. The one that Messiah went out of business, sadly, and I wish they were still around because they set a good example. They really did. You can use all peripherals, all NES peripherals, even though the one flaw with the Generation X is that there was no Famicom Famicom expansion port. However, you could use the NES Cellular or NES 4-score on the Generation X. It's just too bad. It's just too bad that these companies decide to separate the control ports and make the NES Satellite or NES 4-score unusable on it. I just don't get that. And those are the biggest flaws physically with the RetroN 5. What a wasted opportunity, Hyperkin. What a wasted opportunity. Even though you care for the fans and try to get them what they want, try to give them what they want, it's the little details that you miss. And the little details are what made those consoles a lot of fun. We don't get that with the RetroN 5 because you screwed up, Hyperkin. You did. You really did. By not putting a Famicom expansion port on the RetroN 5 and not putting a Game Boy link cable connection and not putting the NES control ports together, those are the little details that you messed up on. And as for that, I'm going to give the RetroN 5 physical review 3 out of 4 stars. Now, the controller looks great, and the design of the RetroN 5 looks great. But because of those little details that you failed to put in, that's why it's getting a 3 out of 4. Because it's not perfect. And if you would have put those little details, it probably would have gotten a higher rating by me. But because of that, I have to give it a 3 out of 4 stars. And that's my physical review of the RetroN 5. So Hyperkin, I hope next time you'll think of those little details that you didn't put with the RetroN 5. As for the official review, it'll depend. It will depend. If I see reviews and if the RetroN 5 performs well, then I might get it. Otherwise, I'm not going to buy it because it's not worth buying it for $100 and for it not performing well. So that's all you pretty much got to say about the RetroN 5. But now let's get on with the news at hand about this new system that's going to be coming out pretty soon, and it's by a different company. This is not by Hyperkin. This is by Analogue Interactive, and the name of the system is called Analogue Nt. And all I gotta say is, it's about time! And I'll tell you why in a minute. First off, I gotta explain what the Analogue Nt is. And you probably saw the picture before I'm even telling you about it. The Analogue Nt plays NES and Famicom games. And I believe it's gonna have the same motherboard as the NES. However, here's the big surprise. You won't even need an NES Satellite or NES 4-score to actually play those 4-player games that you always wanted to play. Because it's going to have 4 controller ports. 4! Which means you won't even need the NES Satellite or NES 4-score. And that is an awesome feature on its own, especially when there was games like Super Spike V-Ball or Gauntlet 2, which I do have. Like I think I mentioned that before. I'm not sure if I actually mentioned that before. I can't keep track. But Gauntlet 2 actually allowed for 4 players. And you'll be able to play 4 players with the Analogue Nt. It's that awesome. Now there's a couple of questions I just want to ask about the Analogue Nt, and I hope somebody from Analogue Interactive is watching. My first question is, will it have the Famicom expansion port? Because it would be a real shame if the Famicom expansion port is not on the Analogue Nt. Because without it, none of the peripherals from the Famicom will be used on the Analogue Nt. So I hope the Famicom expansion port is there. The second thing, will the additional sound channels or sound chips be on the Analogue Nt that were on the Famicom? And the third thing is price. Will it be cheaper, a lot cheaper than the consoleized MVS Neo Geo, or will it be about the same? Those are the only questions that I ask, and hopefully I'll have those questions answered pretty soon. Now I know that the Analogue Nt has been delayed slightly. Orders and stuff and questions will be answered by the end of April, but I don't know that. Hopefully we'll get an answer by the end of April. So, and those are the only questions that I asked. That's pretty much it. If you can answer that for me, comment down below. That's all I gotta say. Well, I've talked about enough about the Analogue Nt and the RetroN 5, so I'm going to end it here, and hopefully I'll be getting some news about both of those systems in the near future. And once I get more news about the Analogue Nt, I'll happily bring that along. So that's it for now, and I hope you enjoyed. Peace out, and by the way, that was also my physical review of the RetroN 5 too. I might do an overall review someday, but for now, that will be for another time. So thanks for watching. Peace out. Happy gaming.